Welcome to the Westborough Historical Society's monthly program. Tonight, we have a very special guest. I'm sure that's why you're all here, and Chris is going to introduce her. I'm just going to welcome you to the Society. The house, this is the William Sibley House, for those of you that don't know. It was built in 1844. William, and along with his brother Frank, built sleighs in their workshops in the backyard. And Westborough was known for its sleigh industry. We have so much going on this month and next month because we had a lot of cold weather and snowy weather, so things got postponed and moved around. So this month, also happening, a week from Tuesday, which would be the 14th, is our book group, and that's during the day. That's Tuesday mornings at 10, and we are discussing this book, Massachusetts in the Women's Suffrage Movement. And it is an excellent book. If you have not had a chance to read it, but you're still interested in the topic, feel free to come in. The discussions are always lively, and we meet here at 10 a.m. Also, Thursday evening, April 16th at 7, we are delayed and celebrating Black History Month, which was in February. We rescheduled an evening of poetry with Phyllis Wheatley. For those of you that are familiar with her work, it was a pivotal piece of our revolutionary history, and we're just going to read her poems. There's no homework, there's no come prepared. If you're interested, please join us. If you have a favorite Phyllis Wheatley poem, we'd love to know what it is. We'll have a copy of it in our stuff, I hope. And come share that evening with us while we pay tribute to a really special person. And on Monday, April 27th at 7 p.m., Gary Gregory will be here. He was originally scheduled for this time slot tonight, but he does reenactments, and he was called to Ticonderoga for filming. So he will do his program on the Revolutionary era here in Westborough, and I really look forward to it. Gary's a real expert. And that's just April. May 14th is a Thursday at the Willows. We have a reenactor coming to portray John Adams. And for those of you that have been around, you know we're interested in John and Abigail. Abigail's really who I'm interested in. And on May 19th at the Senior Center, for those of you who participate in the tea at the Senior Center, Leslie and I are going to be doing a John and Abigail program there too.
I'm John.
She's John. and so that's May. And then we have our annual sale coming up the second weekend in June. That's a Saturday morning. We always have unique things. It's not your typical yard sale. People donate us items that are we always get something interesting. And we are cleaning out our closet. We are getting rid of some of our old frames and some of our pieces that people have just given us over the years but aren't particularly linked to Westborough history. So we will have frames for sale that you can cut down and make fabulous frames for your own stuff. And we hope you'll come join us for that sale as well. I'm going to turn it over to Chris. Chris Allen, our program chairman. Thank you.
Hi, it's great to see so many of you here tonight. As Leslie said, I'm Chris Allen, program chair, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce Michelle Gross, who is our home archaeologist. Michelle was raised in Toronto, Canada, and majored in archaeology at the University of Western Ontario, right? And then she did 2 years in Cyprus in a wonderful Roman dig and got a lot of experience there. When she moved to Westborough in 1989, she joined Professor Curtis Hoffman of Bridgewater State, who had been doing archaeology work in Westborough since 1974 with a whole team. And Michelle and Professor Hoffman worked together and discovered some wonderful artifacts, which they not only preserved but documented beautifully, so they are in the town records, and also many of them are at the Westborough Historical Commission. Tonight, well, actually currently, Michelle is a yoga therapist, and she has her own private yoga practice and teaches yoga to instructors all over the world. So she's very busy with many different kinds of things. But tonight we're lucky because Michelle is going to describe her work in archaeology in Westborough from the time she came to Westborough, but this work actually started in the 70s. And there are major, wonderful sites of archaeology, particularly around places like the headwaters of the Sudbury River, which is Cedar Swamp, and of the Assabet, around the pond, and then Lake Hoccomocco, which is near Charlestown Meadows, and of course Naagawoomcoom, which you may know as Lake Chauncy. So there's quite a bit of activity. Thousands of years ago, Westborough was very attractive, particularly to native peoples of the Nipmuc tribe, and they did wonderful artifacts to help them in hunting, fishing, battles. Eventually, a lot of these artifacts date around 6,000 years ago, some even 8,000, and some even earlier. So we're lucky tonight to have Michelle describe her work in archaeology and the fact that Westborough is a very rich location for this activity. Michelle.
Well, hello. So yes, I moved here in actually 1988, and I was fresh off the digs in Cyprus, so I decided to volunteer with Kurt Hoffman. And I would just go down whenever I had time and work on the digs with him. So not officially as an archaeologist, I didn't get paid. So you can't call me a professional, I guess. But anyway, it was a lot of fun. And it was a really time when we were just starting to uncover Charlestown Meadows. They'd already moved from Cedar Swamp, and they were doing Charlestown Meadows at that time. And so it was amazing what we were finding there. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. So it was a lot of fun. I do have an old picture just to kind of show you what it looks like when you're digging in an archaeology dig. It's kind of, you divide it into squares, and you dig up and you go through the layers, and when you find things that are datable, meaning they've got some sort of carbon around them, some sort of fire pits or that kind of stuff, you can date things. Okay, so if you want to know more of like the details, the details of this area, more than what I'm going to give you tonight, because my goal is just to give you kind of an overview, right? I don't want to give you a lot of data that you could read if you're really interested in Curtis Hoffman's book, People of the Freshwater Lake, A Prehistory of Westborough, Massachusetts. Okay, so this is actually really interesting if you're more interested in just data, which, it is, if you're interested, it's really good. All right, I'm going to put that there. So to better understand the archaeology in the Westborough area, we must look at the bigger picture. How long have humans been in North America, right? So for decades, the theory was that humans had migrated across the Bering Strait at about 15,000 years ago. The strait was iced over during the Wisconsin Ice Age, which spanned from 71,000 to 12,000 years ago, and it would have made a convenient bridge from what is now the Soviet Union. But there is new evidence from California that suggests that humans have been here for way longer, like 130,000 years. Interestingly, this corresponds to the ending of the Illinoisan Ice Age, which lasted from 191,000 years ago to about 130,000 years ago. So it makes sense if humans all of a sudden show up after one ice age, Now they're discovering they may have shown up way earlier than they thought after that other ice age. As all ice ages and glacial periods do, this one dramatically altered the landscape of North America. And you know, it would have really destroyed a lot of the evidence of human activity. It will be interesting to see what will be discovered in the future, right? As archaeology begins to utilize these highly sensitive tools and machines now to be able to see into the earth. Have you guys heard of some of the stuff that's going on in South America, right?
Yeah.
They're starting to look, you know, with these machines that can look into the earth, they can look down and they can see the layers of all the things. So, you know, none of that's really being done anywhere around here because the assumption was that nothing would be here. And this brings me to one of my main points, because this is really where we begin, the assumptions that we make, right? When we start to dig or we start to look at sites, you go in with these preconceived ideas and you don't see what's there. And so, you know, there's a lot of data that's being done, there's a lot of analysis being done on things, but given the broader context of what's happening in archaeology now, I think it's time to rethink it and re-look at what we have here. Because Westborough is an amazing area for archaeology. So the Boston area was settled about 12,000 years ago, from what they have discovered so far. And as the glaciers melted, the shoreline changed dramatically. Boston shoreline was about 11 miles further out than it is now. Right? And many of the islands, including Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, were part of the mainland, the Rock Islands. The current islands throughout the whole harbor are rich with diverse evidence of settlements and fishing cultures from this time. There's a wide variety of tools, toys, jewelry from the coastal sites. They represent the many activities that occupied the lives of Native Americans as they moved through their seasonal rounds. There are woodworking tools, projectile points, which are spear, arrowheads. There are net weights and plummets used for fishing. This is an example of a plummet that we found in Westborough over at Cedar Swamp. And so they would tie the string here and use it to drop the nets down. I'll put that there. Anyone can look at those when we're done. The Native Americans of the Massachusetts Bay had trading networks that stretched beyond New England. Some of the stone used to make projectile points was traded from the Hudson River in New York, and the copper used for beads may have come from as far away as the Great Lakes region. Of course, if you study the archaeology of the whole East Coast, it is clear that there were trade networks all the way up and down the coast, even down to Florida. They find shells in New York that can only come from Florida. Core samples taken in Cedar Swamp indicate that about 13,000 years ago, there was open spruce woodlands and grasses emerging in the area. People started moving in from the west and south as the land began to emerge from the ice. 400 years later, there was enough wildlife and vegetation to make it the earliest human settlement in Worcester County. The Wisconsin Glacier was about 1.5 miles thick. Think about that, right? Think of even how this winter, how the snow packed down the earth, right? And you notice that you go out there to your garden and all of a sudden there's all these things that weren't there last year. They've all of a sudden come up in my backyard, which is just around the corner. All of a sudden these little bricks with names have come up, which are, I think, a pet cemetery that I never knew was there. It must be from like the 18th century. So. But anyway, so the earth, you know, gets depressed and then it starts to spring back up. And as the ice melted, it left behind vast amounts of water. The glacial lake, Lake Sudbury or Assabet, depending on what articles you read, covered most of Westborough until about 9,000 years ago. The central island in Cedar Swamp emerged from the lake at the end of the early Middle Archaic and has been inhabited or used as a hunting campsite since then. This is why Cedar Swamp has been designated in the National Register of Historic Places since about 1988. The island offers a glimpse into a way of life starting about 9,000 years ago. The oldest point made of black feldsite was discovered when developers were building the mall on East Main Street. It dates to about 9,000 years old or early Archaic. There are 8 documented sites that date back 6,000 to 8,000 years ago in Cedar Swamp. These include stone projectile points made of rhyolite and argillite derived from the Boston Basin, so they were definitely trading with Boston. They were used to produce the Neville and Stark points that you can see in the collection of artifacts in the Historical Society's office in Westborough. So if you're ever interested, I'm sure Chris would be happy to make a little date to take you in
The
there.
historical mission.
Yes.
Commission.
Yes. Wetlands and upland lakes and rivers were a source of vegetables and animals for food. They provided shelter during certain seasons and permanent water sources, as well as transportation corridors for hunters and social movement. Well after Westborough was established, there was even a small group of Native Americans that used the island in Cedar Swamp to retreat to. When I first moved to Westborough, there was a woman who lived down the street from me, Lillian, and she used to tell me stories about how when she first moved to Westborough, she was terrified because the Indians still lived in Cedar Swamp, and that they would come out occasionally, and she was always scared. She was always scared they were going to do something to her. Anyway, around 6,000 years ago, Lake Sudbury had a large drainage event and more intensive occupation of the island in Cedar Swamp started happening. Between 6,000 to 3,000 years ago, the islands and surrounding areas were used mostly for lookouts and hunting camps. Hazelnuts were carbon dated at the fishing site in Cedar Swamp at approximately 5,200 years old. Fall activities included deer hunting, nut processing, which likely meant this was not just hunters, right? But the whole family unit, moving through the area to forage and hunt and process food for the winter. Pollen cores show hickory, maple, white pine, oak, birch, hazelnut, and walnut trees emerging around this time, as well as diverse aquatic plants. The lakeshore provided abundant resources, including wetland plants and grasses. This period of usage and occupation was intense and included tool production from local quartzite. They would bring a core, which means a large piece of a material that they were going to use, and they would bring it to the island and work it into projectile points or scrapers or gouges or whatever they were making them into. The areas around Cedar Swamp are littered with these work areas. There is evidence of woodworking tools and canoe making, charred materials and midden sites. Midden is the technical archaeological term for a garbage dump. Indicate processing of tree nuts and seeds as well as mortar and pestle to grind them. So they weren't just collecting seeds now, they're also processing them, making flowers, making things out of them. Charlestown Meadows is another site in Westborough, that's the one near Hoccomocco Pond, that had substantial occupation at this time. Between 6,300 and 4,300 years ago, there was a growing complexity to the community. We found projectile points in the Otter Creek, Brewerton, and Vosburg styles, as well as plummets, scrapers, choppers, drills, and fishing plummets. Actually, I believe that one comes from there. And then this is also one of the Vosburg style points that we dug up there. You can see how, it's got the little notches for being attached to a pole or... So, it was likely a fall harvesting site and has more Brewerton and Vosburg points than any other known site in the Northeast. They built structures in Charlestown Meadows. They built long, oval-shaped homes, and the radiocarbon dating of the floor samples places them at around 5,225 years ago, plus or minus 200 years. The largest is 16 meters long by 10 meters wide, with small pits, flake scatterings, butchered bone concentrations, and rock platforms for drying and processing meat and fish. I remember when we first started finding the rock platforms, we were like, does this ever end? It was just like rocks all done together, and they were all burnt. And you couldn't see any of the poles anymore. It's too old, right? The wood had already rotted a long time ago. But you could clearly see they were laid out very distinctly for drying meats and fishes. The maximum estimated population at this time is to be around 50 people. By 4,300 years ago, Charlestown Meadows shows more use of local quartzite. The houses become smaller and they're more numerous. There are turtle remains which date summer activity in the camp to around 4,000 years ago. We can only speculate as to the social shifts that were happening, of course. Clearly the population was growing, but the shift to smaller homes and more defined work areas indicated different social organization than previously. The tools began to shift at the time. They're making more use of local materials. So this is one of the little orient points that we found there. And you can see they're making out of local quartzite instead now. And almost all the tools around this time start to shift to this material. They're no longer coming from Boston, the material. By 2700 to 1,000 years ago, the focus seems to shift back to Cedar Swamp, where there is evidence of more permanent communities. The people were staying longer and settling, and there is evidence of travel by both water and foot. Westborough was truly crisscrossed by ancient pathways. So there was a trail that ran along 135 and divided in Northborough. One branch led west through Rutland, Greenfield, and onto the Mohawk country, further west. Another, which ran along the ridge above Ruggles Street, goes all the way to Canada, where the Iroquois lived, near Montreal. This trail was widely used. In 1704, right, it was used to kidnap the Rice Boys. Remember that story? Yeah, everybody here can know their history of Westborough. and they were brought back to Canada. South Street was a Narragansett Trail, which extends to Mendon and down to Providence. The old Connecticut path also crosses through town. It branches from the Nashua Trail at Waltham and goes through Framingham, Ashland, Hopkinton, Westborough, Grafton, and on to Hartford. And these were just the footpaths. Sudbury River has its headwaters in Cedar Swamp. Blackstone River empties into Narragansett Bay, an easy portage from here at that time. The Assabet River headwaters are also in Westborough, and this connects to the Concord and the Merrimack Rivers. All these paths and waterways were in use by the native population for thousands of years. Around 3,000 years ago, there was a dramatic increase in algal colonies in Cedar Swamp and evidence of increased domestic activities. Basically what that means is that there was a lot, how when you get pollen samples here too, right? So like some years they're really big and you get a lot of pollen, like, your car turns green. And so like certain things are blooming, whatever. So there was a lot more all of a sudden starting to bloom. There was a lot more happening in the world of the forests around. People were becoming more sedentary. This is called the early woodland period and is defined by about 1,500 years. Now we see construction of communal structures in the area and ceramic making and decorating. The area of community living become more defined. Let's see, I think I brought a picture. I took pictures a few years ago for another talk I did, and I found them this morning. That's the pottery. Pottery doesn't look like much, that's the problem, this stuff. Think about how wet Cedar Swamp is. But if you want to look at this picture, I can even pass this one around. The pottery, you can see how they indented into it. They made patterns in the pottery. So it's not just like if I held it up, you'd just see, it looks like a rock. But if you look at it a little closer, you can actually see that they made tools to make patterns in the pottery. So, and we found some of those as well. You can see those in the cases. Let's see, there are earthen ovens, rock platforms again for smoking and drying meat. The tools include bifaces, wedges, unifaces, scrapers, which were used for cleaning hides, and made all from local resources, or mostly from local resources. The orient point that I showed you can see in the Westborough collection, that was just one small one of them. There is evidence of an increasing number of sites, but still the main base was the island. By the end of this period, Cedar Swamp 3, which is the name of one of the sites that was dug, they all are all named, numbered, shows the densest population and a year-round community. It covers about 30,000 square meters. Pottery becomes more prevalent and storing of food. Charlestown Meadows seems to be mainly used as a seasonal base camp by this time, and there were over 150 features identified before it was bulldozed to build the Avalon community. This was a major center for stone tool manufacturing, meat and fish smoking and preserving. There was evidence of agriculture. Cedar Swamp would not have been suitable, so they would have looked for somewhere else. Cedar Swamp would have been too wet. So maybe this was a satellite community or a fall base camp for harvest and food prep. The Middle Woodland times, 1500 to 800 years ago, saw a decline in the population of Westborough. The area served as a trade corridor, with stones from Pennsylvania and New York found at various sites throughout Westborough. But the wet and rocky hills of Westborough were not ideal for larger communities that were forming during this period. And it was likely that the area served more as a hunting ground and summer camp and not as a permanent large community. By the late woodland period, about 900 to contact, there were well-established communities throughout New England. If we take a wider view of North America, this period is marked by remarkable ceremonial sites and cultural artifacts. The effigy mound culture in Nebraska, Oklahoma, Ohio, Missouri, Minnesota, Iowa, Kansas, and South Dakota included many tribes. They created mounds or effigies, effigy in the shapes of bears, birds, panthers, snakes, and water spirits. They're so large that they were not even recognized until they were seen from the air. From above, the animals are clearly defined. Nose to tail, a trail of ceremonial burial mounds that count in the thousands. And they're made of earth, ceremonial artifacts, human bones, so they were clearly used as burial sites. Many of them have been destroyed by farming and settlements over the years, but you can still see some at the Effigy National Park in Iowa. And actually, I was just at a yoga course last week, and someone told me that she lives in Boise, Idaho? Yeah. She said that they had just found one and preserved it there as well. So they're now looking for them with this new technology, right, where they can look from the air and they can identify things that are on the forest floor. When you expand the lens wider, this culture, designated as Hopewell, extends from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains and is classified by geometric structures and mounds of different animal forms. So I was just reading at the end of Curtis Hoffman's books that I was sitting there waiting to talk, and he was brought to many of those sites around here and basically poo-pooed them and said, oh, that was probably built by, whatever. But none of this other stuff had been found yet. So start to think about it in a different lens. In Massachusetts, a snake effigy mound, 50 feet long, 35 feet wide, was discovered in Worcester. And on the Westborough-Upton line, there is a snake effigy that is 30 feet in diameter. There is a fascinating Facebook page actually dedicated to the ancient stone mysteries of New England. I found it quite fascinating. I found it while I was reminding myself of some of the data for this talk. And evidence continues to mount that much of North America was trading ideas and ceremonial traditions. I just read an article in the current National Geographic about cacao, or chocolate, right? And how widely it was used and traded in Mayan times. And they used to think it was very localized, but now they've had to expand their view. And they're finding it in urns that they're finding thousands of miles away from where they thought it ever was. So things are opening up. People did not stay still. When Europeans arrived in New England, they found this patchwork of native groups, and the area of Worcester County and Westborough were inhabited by the Nipmuc, or people of the freshwater lake. Westborough has 5 major sites of archaeological interest: Cedar Swamp, Hoccomocco Pond, Charlestown Meadows, Lake Chauncy, and Mill Pond. Many of the sites have only had test pit samples done to make way for building and development. Given the context, the pathways, the overall development of tribal cultures in North America, how much more is there to discover? There are boxes of data that already exist and need to be reorganized, and the museum that is currently at the Historical Commission needs updating. There are truly some beautiful artifacts in the collection, and we are one of the only towns in New England that has the right to keep and display our own artifacts. And that was mostly due to Jackie Tidman's work. She was fierce about it. She wanted us to keep our artifacts. She did a ton of things to also get Cedar Swamp named a historical site. Cedar Swamp has only been partially explored, and if there is time and money and interest, right, could reveal more hidden treasures. Archaeology is beginning to expand its view of the extent of human activity in North America. How does Westborough fit into that bigger view? And that is really all I have to say, because data is data. Data you can always look up. But the idea is that, you know, we really do live in a place that has only the surface being scratched. Even to do some more work in Cedar Swamp, even if you just take that one site and you finish it, it would be amazing to see what's there, looking with new tools and to see what's under the surface. All right, thank you.
Thank you.